After 9/11, President Bush proclaimed a war against terrorism. Does Caribbean governments have a counterterrorism policy?
When America wants to know what's happening in the Caribbean diaspora, there is one clear choice.
Hello, welcome to CaribNation.
Both people inside and outside are
very excited about today's program.
Looking at you, I can tell that you have traveled the journey.
One television organization brings America close to the people, stories, and events that affects Caribbean life. Get close, get answers, get CaribNation.
Welcome to CaribNation. Today we are discussing the issue of Caribbean counterterrorism policy. The Caribbean is not known as an area where there are terrorist activities. Today in our studios, we have three eminent Caribbean nationals who will discuss with us whether the Caribbean has a policy on counterterrorism or not. We have with us Mr. Curtis Ward, attorney at law, former Jamaican ambassador to the United Nations and an expert on this subject. Dr. Wilfred David, who is a professor at Howard University, but also an expert on the Caribbean, its peoples and its culture. And we have Dr. Acklyn Lynch, well-known professor from Maryland University. Gentlemen, welcome to CaribNation. Ambassador Ward, we'll begin with you because you have written quite a lot on this subject and has been doing some work at the UN on it. Can you begin by just telling us, does the Caribbean have a counterterrorism policy?
The short answer to that is no. What the Caribbean is seeking to develop is a security policy which encompasses transnational crime, illicit trafficking in small arms, drug trafficking, and counterterrorism. So it is in that context that we have to view the Caribbean.
So counterterrorism is just part of a kind of more global security problem. Is that what you're saying?
Well, basically it is a Caribbean security problem, but terrorism is not paramount in terms of the Caribbean, but it is a factor in terms of its security development.
So there is a policy, but it's not the overall policy. It's a subset of a more holistic kind of policy regarding security. Is that correct?
Yes, I think the counterterrorism efforts, as you quite rightly said, is driven by the United States because of the threat of terrorism with respect to the United States. And the United States tend to try to set the context in which other countries operate in this regard. But there are also international standards which are developed through the United Nations, through International Civil Aviation Organization, World Customs Organization, International Maritime Organization, to which Caribbean countries are members in these organizations and are required by virtue of their membership, and some of these are mandatory, to implement these international standards. The thing is, however, is that the United States also sets its own standards in addition to the international standards, and we can get into some of those later.
Dr. David, you are from Guyana, and the majority of those accused of plotting to blow up the fuel tanks at JFK. How could we agree with what Ambassador Ward is saying now that they seem to be people brought before the courts, they may be extradited, accused of plotting to commit terrorist acts?
Well, we have to distinguish between talk of terrorism, which makes guys feel good, between that and what we should say is real terrorism. In this regard, I believe that terrorism has to do with the lack of an adequate quality of life of the people, and lack of adequate human security. It is distinct from national or military security. And to that extent, most of the Caribbean nations, Guyana in particular, and Trinidad, even rich Trinidad, does not have a modicum of human security, even though it has been growing and it's a very wealthy country. It reflects a situation in which people are imbued with two types of freedom. What we call negative freedom, that is freedom from want, fear, oppression, and things like that, and positive freedom, which reflects the ability to move about, to participate in the things that people want, so that we can't have a counterterrorism policy in that sense, that governments have not really been taking care of the needs of the people.
Dr. Lynch, you are an expert on the culture of the Caribbean. What Dr. David is suggesting is that this is mere talk. What does he really mean? What is it about these Caribbean nationals that have been accused that is merely talk? Is it talk or?
Well, no. First we must identify that really it's just 3 people or 4 people. So when we talk about Caribbean people, it's just 3 or 4 people that have allegedly been involved in this dialogue, and that's what it was, a dialogue between them. And therefore the courts have to look at that. So we can't talk about Caribbean
people. You are
people.
from Trinidad, and there's some link with the
There's one in Trinidad
the Muslimin in Trinidad had attempted. They had taken over the parliament and attempted.
But that's not terrorism. That's not terrorism. No. We can't go there. Let us deal with terrorism and counterterrorism. 3 people have allegedly, or 4 people have allegedly been engaged in this dialogue, in this situation. All right, and that's what we have to concentrate on. Is that enough evidence to apply it to Caribbean people? Now, Caribbean society, Caribbean national society, and regional society has security needs. Very determined security needs, which we must put in place for 20th century politics.
What is a major security need?
The security needs that we have for our society have already been mentioned by Ambassador Ward here. We are concerned about the drug trafficking. We must have security needs to deal with drug trafficking. And since we have become a part of the world, that part of the world that's very significant to the movement of drugs, from its primary source to its marketing location, then we must have something we must be concerned about that. Small arms, we must be concerned about that, so we have to talk about that. And the possibility that our nation, that our respective nations may be subjected to terrorist activities. We had a plane that left Barbados years ago, 10, 20 years ago, that was blown up. And people died. A large number of people died in that plane. And the person who was accused of that act has not been extradited to the Caribbean or to Venezuela, which is part of the Caribbean also, as far as I'm concerned, for trial. So we've got to say, are we in a world today in which security matters are very significant to the region? And finally, are the border questions, which are critical to the dialogue around security, and are most important to the United States, and the regulations established for border control, what is the impact of that on our developmental process and on our resources to be able to meet those kinds of legal challenges? So we have to say, do we have a need for security? Then the answer is yes. If we do have a need in the 21st century, then we must begin to have policies put in place so that security, the security of our nationals must be recognized.
Ambassador, recently we had an international cricket competition in the Caribbean, and there were many visitors from all over the world. There were fears that possibly terrorists might use that occasion to make a point and have publicity. But there were a lot of measures taken, preventative measures. Can you speak a bit about that and how successful the Caribbean has been in preventing any act of terrorism during those events?
Well, basically where the measures were put in place had to do with travel documents, screening of travel documents at airports, customs control, and so on. Being able to transmit manifests, airline manifests, ahead of the airline taking off from where it's coming electronically to the Caribbean, and of course from the Caribbean to North America for screening, so that they could find out if there were anyone on a watch list, perhaps.
So the US and Canada more or less reviewed those lists.
Yes.
Coming from the Caribbean.
Yes.
So we had the assistance of what you would say a more sophisticated intelligence service.
As a matter of fact, 5 countries in the Caribbean had in place the most sophisticated pre-screening technology.
Which were those 5? With those 5?
There was Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, I think St. Lucia, and Antigua, if I'm not mistaken. But they had the most sophisticated in the world. There were only 6 countries in the world that had that level of sophistication. The other one was Switzerland.
What gave them that sophistication? Technology?
The technology that was set up primarily for this purpose.
So Caribbean governments have been investing.
It was loan technology.
Oh, it was loan technology.
A lot of it was loan technology.
Okay, so it's back.
You know, as a matter of fact, the head of Interpol, in visiting the Caribbean, said he hoped that all countries in the world would step up to this level of technology. In Jamaica, for instance, a couple of years ago, in collaboration with the United States and a technology firm out of Canada, they put in place a new database and computer screening at the airport, where if you have someone on an international watch list, or if you have stolen passports, and so on. And incidentally, there are millions of stolen passports being used around the world. And this is one of the things that the system that was put in place in the Caribbean for World Cup cricket tied directly into Interpol's database, where these stolen passports are stored. The numbers for them are stored. So if someone was traveling on a stolen passport, it would immediately flash on a computer screen at one of the immigration services throughout the Caribbean during Cricket World Cup.
Dr. David, it seems to me that what you are emphasizing, and perhaps everybody around this Caribbean round table, is that there's a development approach to security and to terrorism. Or you?
Yes, because this war on terrorism seems to have taken on a life of its own. And everything is left to the war on terrorism, all monies and all efforts and so on. Now, of course, there are drugs and other kinds of things, threats of insurgency in the Caribbean. I'm not denying that. But there's a long-standing need for more human security in the Caribbean, development of the Caribbean.
And you think that will prevent terrorism and or mother terrorism?
Terrorism arises because people are deprived. It may be that in the case of the Middle East and other places, people have religious and other reasons. I'm not saying poverty is the only reason, but I would think that the lack of development and poverty and social ills and so on are the breeding ground for terrorism, where leaders do not talk to people, where large groups of people feel isolated, and therefore they feel they must destroy the society because they're not given a voice. People need a voice to discuss their needs. They must be listened to the politician. It doesn't matter how much money is spent on counter-terrorism in the form of airport security, in curbing the drug traffic. If the people, however we define them, or if substantial groups of people in the society feel that they are left out of the process, if they cannot feed their children, if of course they do not feel safe, if they do not have jobs, then you know, the whole thing is lost. We have to start with the people.
Dr. Lynch, based on your enormous knowledge in the Caribbean, there are Muslims in the Caribbean, and the entire war against terrorism as advocated by President Bush is based on the thesis that there are extremists, fundamentalists, Muslims, people like bin Laden and them, who have a particular interpretation of Islam. Based on your knowledge of the Caribbean Muslims, is there a link between the Caribbean Muslims and that trend in the Islamic world?
I believe that orthodox fundamentalism exists in the world, whether it is Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, whatever it is. It exists in various aspects of the world in terms of how people interpret their relationship to their gods and what that orthodoxy means to them.
But the tradition of Caribbean Muslims.
Wait a minute. But I think in recent language, especially the language around terrorism, in recent language, terrorism has been taken and put into a political location in which that language feeds into an idea that a certain group of people are terrorists. And that is Muslim people. I disagree with that. Now, revolutionary people years ago in the Caribbean, in Africa, Fidel, whoever it was, China, etc., would have been considered terrorists today, according to the dialogue that is proposed at the political level. The question becomes, how do you define terrorism? That's why I say, I totally agree with Ambassador Ward. National security and regional security are very, very important things that we must consider, because our economic progress depends upon that security, and we must define it in 21st century terms, and we must define it within the reality of the 21st century. But political interpretation of this word that has suddenly now become part of our lives, and that is terrorism. That political interpretation comes from one source. It comes from the West, and its rhetoric and its journalism and its media influences of using that word, rather than come from the source of the people themselves and how they see themselves. Islamic people are people who are deeply concerned about how they interpret the universe, whether they are in, I don't care whether it's Pakistan, Bangladesh, or whether they're in the Soviet Union, what's they call the Caribbean, place? Or the Caribbean, or whatever it is. The Muslim means in the Caribbean and the actions of the Muslims, which is really a small group in the Islamic community in Trinidad and Tobago, which is a small group in the Islamic world in Trinidad. The Muslims are small. The Muslims carried out an act in 1991, and that act was not even considered an act of terrorism then. It was considered an act where they tried to take over the government. They tried to have a coup d'etat. It failed. And they have gone on from that. They have been tried in courts several times, and they've walked. They've gotten away according to the legal structures. Now we want to apply the word terrorism to the Muslim means. And therefore, anything that happens in the Caribbean, we want to say is a Muslim. We can't say it's Rastas. We can't say it's Christians, so it's got to be the Muslims. I mean, that is absurd. I reject that. I am concerned about the security of the Caribbean. I'm concerned about the security of humanity wherever we are. and the conditions under which we live. I am concerned about his proposals, which I find very, very interesting and challenging and has certain applicability. But I'm not concerned with bandishing around and throwing around a political term that is crafted for us so that we must believe in it and start pointing fingers at people on the basis of journalistic sentiments.
Ambassador, Mr. Bush has had difficulties since 9/11 to get governments in the global south, the developing world, to buy into the war against terrorism. Now, with the recent allegations of a plot that involve Caribbean nationals, do you believe the Caribbean governments will now buy into that war against terrorism?
No. Basically, what it is that we talk about is establishing the laws and the operational mechanisms to deal with criminal acts, to be able to exchange information, to be able to provide mutual legal assistance, to be able to do investigations and so on. Now, an act of terrorism, and there are all kinds of definitions of terrorism, and as most of you will already know, that there is no universally accepted definition of terrorism. And this has been
Why?
Well, primarily because someone's terrorist is someone's hero. And the clearest definition that one can come to is that any act that wantonly takes civilian life to force a government to do something is regarded as terrorism. That's the closest that they've come to defining terrorism. So what we have done in the international arena is to take 13 international conventions that deal with certain criminal acts, such as hijacking, acts on aircraft, in airport facilities, on oil platforms, kidnapping of diplomats, and so on and so forth, and define those as international terrorism. This is a legal definition. So while there is no a single definition of terrorism, there are a series of criminal acts which are now considered international terrorism. And all countries of the world are required, under resolution of the UN Security Council, to become parties to those 13 conventions and to be able to put in place the domestic laws and the regulations and so on, and have the executive machinery to cooperate with other states in prosecuting people who commit these acts, because these are now in international law, international terrorism. But you know, I'd just like to comment a little bit about the term war on terrorism. This is a misnomer. And one of the major difficulties that the Bush administration has in selling this concept is that nobody believes you can declare war on a phenomenon. And by talking about war on terrorism, the United States has essentially elevated Osama bin Laden and his group to statehood. Because you can't declare war against a group of people. It's like war on drugs, it's just a nice phrase. But in countries in Europe today, they have dropped the term war on terrorism.
How do they express it now?
It's against, they're combating terrorism in a sense, but they're carrying out efforts to prevent and suppress terrorism.
Policies and implementing policies.
Exactly, but it's not a war. And that's what got us into Iraq, because they declared a war.
Well, metaphorically, maybe the debate should not be on the war on terrorism. We should continue the war on poverty, inequality, and such ills. Let me,
well, President Johnson did declare war on poverty years ago.
We still have poverty, right?
Yeah, but let me read, just for a while, a quotation from Frederick Douglass from a speech he made in April 1886, which expresses this very well. Frederick Douglass said, "Where justice is denied, where poverty is enforced, where ignorance prevails, and where any one class is made to feel that society is in an organized conspiracy to oppress, rob, and degrade them, neither persons nor property will be safe. You see, the war on terrorism is a war, is something which has to do with, property, countries and structures. It's related to what I call the anthropomorphic fallacy. It's not connected with people and how they feel, if I may repeat that. And it's glad that you have an infrastructure, a system of rules which would allow people to board planes and so on. I often laugh when I fly out of the United States, how much time I must spend taking off my shoes and things like this, a nuisance, so that I would be safe. But it doesn't make me a better person. So I want to re-emphasize, in the image of Frederick Douglass, what terrorism is about.
We may spend some time grappling with the term terrorism, but I think that really what we should move to is really the question of security. Is the Caribbean secure? And what does security mean?
Well, let's say tourism.
Tourism
is important for development.
But there's not
tourism is important for development.
Yeah, tourism is important.
To what extent the recent allegations about Caribbean nationals affected tourism?
Well, all right, tourism is important, but we also have to remember that there are other things. There is bauxite, there is natural gas, there is oil. We have critical relations with and that we're deciding with Venezuela and Cuba, what will happen down the road. All these are critical security matters for us. Right. What happens in Cuban society over the next 25 years, or in Jamaican, or in Colombia, in the northeastern part of Colombia. We have a situation that is worse than Darfur, where where genocide is actually taking place by an army and also by paramilitary troops, and therefore those are critical to the Caribbean.
It is quite clear, gentlemen, that we have to work more on a holistic security policy at the national, sub-regional, and regional level in the Caribbean. And in having this holistic view about security, one component has to deal with the realities of the aspects of terrorism, as Ambassador Ward pointed out. This is an ongoing discussion, and we hope here in CaribNation that we will continue to deepen our knowledge on the issue of security in the Caribbean, because it's very important for its people, its cultures, and its civilization. On behalf of CaribNation, thank you for listening to us. I am Paul, Nehru, Tennassee.